Logan. Thank you to your team here at Families First for continuing to support the bereaved in our community. We're very grateful for that. Good evening, everyone. I am Christine McMillan. I have a private practice. I also have a professional relationship with Families First, and I'm quite honored to be here with you tonight. I am grateful that you've chosen to share this evening with me. I am, however, sad that of the reason that you're here, because you're bereft by suicide. I'm sorry about that. However, I am glad to see you because that's telling me that you have set your intention to heal, to learn about what grief is about, to learn more perhaps, to learn about perhaps things that you didn't know that your loved one had gone through before they died by suicide. So thank you very much for being here this evening. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We'll be here for about an hour and a half. I welcome your questions. We have a small group tonight. Thank you for joining us, for everyone who is joining us via live streaming. So feel free to ask me any questions along the way. This is not quite a support group format, but certainly if you need me to clarify anything, review anything, you have any questions about what I've shared with you, feel free to put your hand up and interrupt me. I welcome that as well. The washrooms, you can use the doors in the back, and the washrooms are going to be straight ahead of you, both men and women. I'll ask if you want to take a break, and it's totally up to the group. If you need to get up and stretch your legs at any point during the evening, or if you feel you just need a little emotional break, certainly feel free to do that as well. I've turned off my cell phone, so I wonder if we could do that as well. Just check our cell phones to make sure they're on mute. Okay. So tonight, as I said, we're going to talk about what grief is. We're going to talk a little bit about suicide. And I want to end on a hopeful note that wherever you are in your journey, you will get to the point of your hope growing, and that you will be able to get through living with this type of death of your loved one. Wanna go? We're having a little technical problem here. Oh, okay, good, thank you. I wish I could explain it so someone could understand it. I'm afraid it's something I can't put into words. There's just this heavy, overwhelming despair, dreading everything, dreading life, empty inside to the point of numbness. It's like there's something already dead inside. My whole being has been pulling back into that void for months. The same person said, I had tried years earlier to kill myself and nearly died in the attempt, but did not consider it either a selfish or a not selfish thing to have done. It was simply the end of what I could bear. The last afternoon of having to imagine waking up the next morning only to start all over again with a thick mind and black imaginings. It was the final outcome of a bad disease, a disease it seemed to me I would never get the better of. No amount of love from or for other people, no advantage of a caring family and a fabulous job was enough to overcome the pain and hopelessness I felt. Both these quotes are from Dr. Kay Redfield Jameson. She's a psychologist who was probably the first person to have a chair at the Faculty of Medicine at the University at Johns Hopkins Medicine in Maryland. She suffers from bipolar disorder. She has attempted to take her life. Her father was a colonel in the Air Force. He too was a PhD, and he also suffered from bipolar disorder. Suicide doesn't discriminate against income, education, cultures, religion, whether we're good or not so good people. It unfortunately afflicts us all. So when we're talking about a sudden death, such as suicide, we're talking about two tracks that you as the bereaved have to navigate. You've got to navigate the grief, but you also have to navigate the trauma associated with the death. So let's start with grief. And those of you who have attended some of my seminars, you know that this is what we always start with. So what is grief? It's something that happens to us when we are separated from somebody that we're attached to, that we love, of meaning to us. It is in fact separation anxiety. So think of an infant when they're separated from their caregivers. They protest. This type of response that we have plays havoc not only with our emotions, but with our bodies, our minds, our relationships, our belief systems. However, it is a natural response. It's not a pathological disorder, like I think our society would have us believe when we grieve. It's both, ironically, universal, because if you have the capacity to attach and you're bereaved, you're going to experience grief. But it's also highly individual. So I am sure if I took a poll of everyone here tonight, no two stories would be exactly alike, but the overarching themes would be similar. So let's talk about how grief affects us. I'd like you to discard the notion of stages. It's quite seductive to think about it in stages, because then we know that there's an end. If I get to 3.5, then I'm closer to 5. Are there 5 stages? I think there are 5 stages. But there aren't. But it will affect us in these realms, as I said earlier. So emotionally, we all recognize that it affects us emotionally. But it plays havoc with our brains. It takes our thinking brain offline when we're emotionally overwhelmed. We can't focus. Our memory is impaired. We don't make good decisions because we're not thinking logically. Those things will all come back if you're experiencing those now. This is stress. Stress is held in the body. Where do you hold your stress? Your back, your neck, your stomach? Is it in knots? Your chest, heaviness, tightness, headaches? It affects how we interact with other people. We can be disappointed with people. We can be annoyed with people because they're not there for us. Or they push us along a little bit too fast. They don't understand what we're going through. Or similarly, or opposite, we could want to be with people. We might feel clingy. We might want our loved ones close to us. And lastly, it affects us in the spiritual realm. By that, I don't necessarily mean religion. I mean, what now? What's the meaning of this? Why did this happen? How do I go on? So grief will come to you in waves. And if you're newly grieving, the waves will be rushing upon you. If you're a little farther on in the grief process, you might find that the waves are a little farther apart. Maybe they don't take you and draw you under as they did in the beginning of the process. That's progress. But grief will touch you on these 5 realms in one way or another, in different kinds of intensities depending on who you are. So no stages. It will evolve. It's continuously changing. And we'll get to what we need to do in order to become more manageable. However, in our society, most of us don't know how to deal with grief. We're not comfortable dealing with deep sadness. We try to deflect it, avoid it, right? Distract ourselves. We try to run away from it. And to be honest with you, right, if those of you know about the fight or flight response, why would we want to move towards pain? Willingly and knowingly. But this is the kind of pain that's been earned because you love and you were attached. And this is the kind of pain we have to move towards in doses. We dose ourselves with our pain. When we can't tolerate the pain, we might engage in these activities. Anybody brave enough to put up their hands? If they can identify. Okay, thank you. Yeah. We do that subconsciously. And our society tells you, right? Keep busy. Get rid of their belongings. It's only going to bring you pain. Why are you doing it? Why are you looking at pictures? Misusing substances, engaging in any kind of addictive behaviors is a way to self-soothe. And remember the last point, when we're emotionally dysregulated, our thinking mind goes offline and we tend to make impulsive decisions. Instead, what we have to do is really slow ourselves down and do what we call grief work. And that's mourning. So grief is what happens to you. Mourning is an active state that helps you through this process. It's an outward expression of how I feel and what I'm thinking. But of course, it's difficult to mourn in our society because we're not patient. We want everyone to be happy. We want everything to be okay. But like a wound, we can't rush a healing process. We can just create conditions where that wound heals in its own time. However, if we ignore that wound, it's likely to become infected. So when we ignore our grief and don't do our mourning, you're increasing the risk of complications. So actually, mourning, the process of feeling and releasing our feelings and emotions and thoughts, turns the sharpness of acute grief into a softer version than we can live with. It softens the edges. Alan Wolfeld says that we tend to carry our grief instead of mourning it. The people who come to see me If they come soon after a death, and I don't mean the next week, the next month, it could be 6 months, depending on circumstances of the death. And it's not unusual with a suicide death or a sudden death that we are in a state of shock and numbness for the good part of the first year. What I do is I'm providing some education and I'm providing supportive counseling. If you put off your grief work and your mourning and you come to me years later, then I'm doing grief intervention, grief therapy. Because you've avoided and put off your grief too long, you've created additional issues. So what are healthy mourning behaviors? As you can see, those are all action. They're externalizing how I feel about this. And yes, it's painful. Instead of I don't want to talk about it, I'm going to be courageous enough to talk about it. Or I can't talk about it right now. I'm not going to make anyone a crier if you're not a crier. But I'm sure there's one thing on that list that you're comfortable with. Or find the way that you can externalize the turmoil that you're experiencing internally. Any questions so far? Anything you want me to clarify, review? Okay, so that's grief. Grief is what happens to us when we're separated from someone we love. And mourning is how I get through it. That's the painful part. That's the part that we don't like, we want to rush through. The part between the date of death and when it starts to soften is a state of suspension, and we don't like being suspended. We don't like being suspended. It's too long. It's not comfortable. But that's how we get through it. So, I'll take you back to this slide. Grief and trauma. So you've also experienced a trauma, all of you, which adds another layer to the bereavement and to the grief. So what's trauma? They're extraordinary occurrences, not because they happen rarely, but because they overwhelm the person's ability to cope. So unlike commonplace misfortunes, traumatic events usually involve a threat to ourselves or to a loved one. Either a real threat to life or a perceived threat. So then what makes an event traumatic? It's the meaning that you attribute to it. Dr. Gabor Mate goes a little further and says, it's not what happened, it's what happened to you inside as a result of the event. How did it change you? How did it affect you? So the meaning it gives you give it, how it affects you internally, is as important as the event. There's certain events that we all agree are traumatic. But a person doesn't have to live the rest of their life being traumatized by it. The origin of the word trauma actually comes from the Greek word wound. It's a wound. When people are suicidal, their thinking is paralyzed. Their options appear sparse or non-existent. Their mood is despairing, and hopelessness permeates their entire mental domain. The future cannot be separated from the present, and the present is painful beyond solace. So Night Falls Fast is a book about understanding suicide. She has also written An Unquiet Mind, which is a memoir about her own journey. So now we're going to transition now into suicide. These items or factors have been found, generally speaking, to be common in people who have died by suicide. Not all of them every time, but it's common to see some, if not all of these factors. So we do know there's enough research out there that there is a biological genetic link. If mental health issues run in the family, the risk is higher. But that in and of itself doesn't mean that someone's going to suicide. There's personality issues. It's been noted that people who die by suicide are very creative, intelligent. They're also very sensitive people. Some of them have high standards for themselves and are constantly trying to achieve. Others may be impulsive, maybe a little reckless in their decision making. If there had been prior attempts, and I know in some cases family members don't know if there were prior attempts. If there were prior attempts, however veiled, it does increase the chances. And then there's life stressors, and either real losses or perceived losses. It could be a disrupted relationship. It could be loss of status, health, a job. I once had a young mom whose son died by suicide, and one of the last things she remembers about her son was that they had had a fight. We'll never know whether or not that young man perceived the end of his relationship with his mother. Not from her perspective, but at that moment, in his state of mind, perhaps that's how we experienced it. Or maybe it was just one more loss after several. Usually when there's such distress, there's use of substances, or misuse or abuse of substances. And again, that's to self-regulate, to calm, to numb, not to feel the pain. It's a way of coping. It's a way of, it's not healthy, but it's a way of coping. It's a way of solving the problem. And then of course we know that when there's use of substances, it changes the structure of our brains. It makes us make decisions we normally would not have made. So that increases the risk as well of perhaps an impulsive act. And then there's social issues as well. High conflict relationships, familial dynamics, unhealthy dynamics in the family. We see that a lot with adolescents. Bullying, discrimination, social isolation, or maybe even just the stigma of accessing mental health or actually access to mental health services. And then of course lastly it's the opportunity, and do they have a means? questions about that? So these are factors that researchers have documented in terms of being common with people who die by suicide. Edward Sneidman, he was an American psychologist, and he really is considered the father of the area called suicidology. He coined the term psych ache. Suicide occurs when the psych ache is deemed by that person to be unbearable. Not necessarily from our perspective, but from their perspective. What they're experiencing, their internal, external world becomes unbearable. So these are common, he's deemed, characteristics of the act of suicide. It's not a random act, he says. It's to seek a solution. It's with a purpose. It's not that they choose death. They want not to be conscious anymore, to continue to feel the pain. The extreme psychological pain is a way to escape that by dying by suicide. Frustrated psychological needs. It could be job loss. I know we had an increase in the deaths by suicide when our economy has been depressed here in Windsor. That in and of itself is not the only reason, because people lose jobs. But other things have to come into play. It's just one more thing. Or those with very high standards, their psychological need to be perfect is blocked because that's impossible to achieve. Perfection. On the other hand, individuals who attribute failure or disappointments to their own shortcomings see themselves as incomplete or worthless. There's always a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. While you and I might be able to say, tomorrow might be better, there is an answer to this. There's a pervasive sense of hopelessness. They don't want to die. So there's a sense of ambivalence. They do want to live. They just don't want to live in the pain. And they don't see, they don't have hope. And is it fair for us to ask them to live with pain? Their thinking becomes constricted. And what we mean by that is tunnel vision. The deeper they get into their mental health disorder, they have blinders on. And then the only thing, the goal is to end their pain. They're unable to see any alternatives. And they're also not only unwilling, but unable to engage in any kind of problem-solving endeavors. They don't see options. So certainly when we're working with suicidal people, we have to stabilize them before we can work on self-esteem and problem-solving. But it's getting to that point many times. And that's difficult. Once again, it's escape from that intolerable pain that is really indescribable. If you honestly believe that whatever you're going through, there's no alternative, no solution, then what are your options? Snyderman has said that he has found that people who die by suicide have communicated in one way or another, either by previous suicide attempts, by veiled communication, and usually we only find out in hindsight. We don't want to ever fall into the trap of not taking anything seriously. And I'm certainly not implying anybody does intentionally. And we're really looking overall at a way of coping with life. In some cases, it's a lifelong pattern. Any questions about that? Comments? Anything you disagree with? Okay. Suicide is an earthquake, a sudden jolting and catastrophic. It ruptures the lives of those it leaves behind. The aftershocks ripple into subsequent generations. We spend years navigating our emotional landscapes, realigned by chasms of guilt, confusion, and regret. Maybe the most ominous ravine is the one filled by stigma. It often seems impossible to cross. If you're comfortable, just by a show of hands or a nod, have any of you experienced in some form some stigma or some shame associated with your loved one's death? It's not uncommon. You have. That complicates the grief. It adds another layer. It minimizes your support system available to you. So where did this come from, the shame or stigma? Does anyone know the historical aspect of the shame and stigma? Janice?
I was just going to say a lack of understanding.
Absolutely. Absolutely. About really the science behind it, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely partially it. Yeah. So it actually goes back to the early church. It was considered desirable, actually, by certain cultures. Even in the Christian church, people chose martyrdom rather than persecution as a way of getting closer to God. But then there was a rash of suicides. And so in order to curtail that, churches forbade it by it becoming a sin. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. Some churches didn't allow the families to bury their loved ones who died by suicide in sacred grounds. They couldn't have services. So that's where the secrecy comes from, the stigma and the shame. What happened was families then lied about how their loved ones died. They weren't forthcoming because they wanted their loved ones to have a religious burial in sacred ground. So they lied about it. They disposed of any evidence of the suicide. And that was perpetuated. However, there was really no teeth behind what the church was doing. And so legal sanctions were imposed. Hence, it became illegal to die by suicide. That's where we get the word commit from. Committed suicide. It was actually in the Criminal Code of Canada until 1978. And those of you who are of a different generation will know it's 1978. As recent as 78, it was illegal to die by suicide. So in the days gone by, well, you couldn't penalize the person who died, so you penalized the family. The shame, the stigma. And I don't know what your experience is, but I know to a certain extent it's still felt in the 21st century. Because, as you said, Janice, people do not understand that it's not a rational choice that our loved ones make. So, because of the shame and stigma, we want to move your experience as those that are bereaved by suicide to a much healthier and neutral discussion about suicide. So, stigmatizing vocabulary such as committed suicide. Did somebody commit dying by cancer? Right? No, we say the person died by cancer, died in a car accident. They didn't commit anything. So instead, we want to replace it with died by suicide, death by suicide, lost their life to suicide. And this will be difficult to train ourselves not to use it. And I kind of cringe whenever I read committed suicide or I hear somebody on TV use that term. I do take an opportunity, if I can, to gently share my information about why it's not a term that's respectful. It's very judgmental, isn't it? Because when you commit a crime, we're imposing a judgment on you. The system is imposing a judgment. You've done something wrong. Successful or completed suicide. Now, that might seem a little odd in terms of stigmatizing vocabulary, but that also implies that a goal was achieved. It was a good thing because we complete a project. We complete our schooling. It's not a good thing for those of you who are sitting in this room and watching us tonight. It's not a good thing. So instead, we will use words like died by suicide, lost their life to suicide. Similarly, on the other hand, failed or unsuccessful suicide. That's when somebody attempts it. That then also implies that they failed. So we're going to say lived through a suicide attempt, or attempted to end their life, or that it was a non-fatal attempt. So those of you watching us from wherever you are, and those of you in the room, if you can take it upon yourself to be conscious of those terms and start using those terms. And this all came, it was very grassroots. It was by people who had lost a loved one to suicide. They objected to the stigmatizing terminology. They wanted something neutral, non-judgmental. And we have judgments around other deaths, don't we? We have judgments around accidental overdoses, right? All types of other deaths. Who gave us that right to judge what another person is going through? Any questions about that? Okay. So, what are you going through? We know, as I said, that this death defies an explanation. It's because it's complicated. Just like suicide is multifaceted, it's multidimensional, so is your grief. So of course the first thing we see is the trauma. Big T trauma. You don't have to come out of this traumatized and be traumatized the rest of your life. But you did experience or are experiencing a trauma. Why? Why did they do it? Why didn't they leave a note? And by the way, historically, we know that notes aren't regularly left for loved ones. And those families that I've supported whose loved ones have left a note, it still doesn't answer why. And we just talked about the societal taboos, the shame and the stigma, and that leads to lack of support and then isolation. And grief can be isolating as it is, because if you remember the first couple of slides, we don't do grief very well. We don't do well with emotional pain. We want you to be happy again. We want you to get on with life. We want you to put it behind you. So if you start off in that mindset, and then you're talking about grieving a death by suicide, as Janice says, there's even less understanding about what you're going through. This is not unusual in any type of death, but it's very heightened in terms of what happened, responsibility. You might be searching internally as well as externally. Who failed? Who caused it? Who's responsible for it? Because again, we want to make sense of events that happen in our life, especially painful things. We see anger, guilt, and sorrow with every grief experience, but again, it's intensified because of the nature of the death. Suicide has been called by people who have lost a loved one to suicide, again, a very grassroots notion, in that it's the ultimate rejection. It's taken very personally on a heart level. On a head level, we know. If we truly believe, if we understand that there were a number of factors leading to it, but there is this feeling of how could they leave me? You're definitely at risk for complicated or prolonged grief. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. Did you have any unfinished business with your loved one? Again, we see that with any death, certainly sudden deaths. But people who are bereaved by suicide don't feel like they got the opportunity for one last chance. Then there's one's own risk for suicidality. Why should I go on? I had a young woman in a support group, a suicide bereavement support group, who had lost her partner and the father of her child to suicide. And she very eloquently shared with us that she was suffering from depression, clinical depression, that she would sit on the floor of the nursery of her child and contemplate suicide because she didn't know how to go on. So she was in a suicide bereavement group trying to get through the suicide of her life partner, and she was contemplating it, sitting in the room of her infant child. What about explaining the cause of death to children? That's a challenge. And what do you think the first thing adults want to do? Is they want to protect the children. And of course, we don't recommend that. We recommend telling them, depending on their age, information that's appropriate to their developmental stage. And there are certain ways of doing it that the expert would recommend. Because when children are told or led to believe that the death was by anything but a suicide, and then they will absolutely find out the truth, you've actually risked your relationship with the child by not telling them the truth. There could even be a sense of relief if your loved one was suffering. This is very difficult for family members to share. You know, they certainly shared it with me in the confidence of a session. And that's okay, because all your feelings are relevant. Would you want your loved one back? Absolutely. Would you want them back suffering? Most likely not. And then we can find that there's an increased awareness of mental health issues. And that can lead to advocacy, involvement with prevention. So, how do I get through this? First of all, remember the 5 areas that grief affects us. You have to attend to all those areas. Whatever you're struggling with at the moment, physically, mentally, cognitively. Whether that's learning to say no, creating boundaries, lowering your expectations of yourself, whatever it takes. Don't do it for anybody else's sake. You are going through this. You write the script on how you're going to take care of yourself. Educate yourself as much as possible about grief, about suicide, and also about trauma, to normalize what you're going through. But you have to do your grief work. You have to do your mourning. That's the painful part. That's the part we don't want to do. And so we bury it, distract. And as Alan Wolfeld says, we carry our grief. We can't live that way. At least not in a peaceful way, in a content way. Lower your expectations, okay? You're undergoing construction. If you're acutely grieving, don't expect what you expected of yourself before the death, especially if you're acutely grieving. Be patient with yourself. Be gentle with every step forward. It's okay to stand still. But do try to establish routines. Don't rush the process. Please do not rush the process. It'll take much longer to get to I don't want to say the end, but to a place where you can live with the grief. Don't waste your grief. What I mean by that is, understand that it's pain that's clean pain, that's come from loving. You've earned this. Not necessarily how they died, but the fact that they died. You've earned this pain by attaching and loving. Believe that this will not last forever. I know. At this moment, you may think it's a forever, but it's not. Keep putting one foot in front of the other. Believe that you could. Set your intention. Set a goal. I will get through this. I don't know when. I don't know how, but I will get through this. And when we do our mourning and grief starts to soften and our energy returns, and we start planning for the future, maybe a little longer into the future. And we can find our grief maybe lifting a little bit. We're not as focused on it anymore. In order to go on living well, we've got to do two things. And that's meaning making and relearning the world. So what do I mean by that? When you're ready, and you'll know, through mourning, we come to meaning making. So loss is simply what happens to you in life, but meaning is what you make happen. So how do you find a way to remain connected with your loved one, not physically, because that's no longer possible, but how do we remain connected with our loved ones through memory, through spirit? We call that an internal representation. So they're not physically here, but we've incorporated them into our being as we move forward. This is very closely connected to the concept of continuing bonds. How do you remember your loved ones, right? People who have died before the suicide happened in your life. How do you remember them? Do you mark their birthdays? Do you donate in honor of them? That's how we make meaning. And relearning the world doesn't necessarily mean knowledge about the world, but it's learning how to act and be in this world without your loved one. Well, that kind of seems obvious, but it includes a lot of facets. First of all, there's going to be changes in the physical aspect, when you go to drive by their workplace or their school or their home. How do you react to it? How do you respond to it? There's changes in relationships. How are you going to now navigate others that are still living? Maybe your other children. And then there's changes in perspective on time too. Past, present, future, before they died, after they died. That's a marker. And then there's changes in the spiritual world, or your spiritual world, in terms of how do I go on? Why did it happen? There's changes internally. Who am I now after having gone through this process? And then changes with your loved one who died. First we see them the way we see them, then we try to see them from their point of view, and then we integrate the two. So those are two things that towards the end of the process, and what I mean by that is when the grief starts to soften, but it happens throughout the process. You're working on it through your mourning. How do I make meaning of this? And how do I learn to live in this world without them? If you're not able, and you're struggling to get to this point, and it has been some time, then these are some of the indicators that you might need to seek professional therapy. So if your grief remains the same, or it's trending, it's getting worse, you're still experiencing any type of traumatic symptomology, if you find you're avoiding your grief work, avoiding places, avoiding talking about your loved one, or it's worsening. Maybe you've fallen into depression, emotional numbness, or maybe others are telling you, you might want to talk to somebody. When your functioning is severely impaired. Any questions? Comments? Just before we end, I have the privilege of introducing you to Janice, who will share her story, her lived experience. And allow me, if you will, Janice, this is your meaning making. This is your connection. Thank you so much.
Okay, can you guys see me?
Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. I'm nervous, so I'm probably going to mostly read it, but I hope you guys understand. There was a before you, and there was a during you. For some reason, I never thought there would be an after you. But there it was, and I was in it. I'll be in it forever. I came across that quote in a book, and I felt it very deeply. I was thinking about how to tell my story. Usually there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But for me, the ending came too soon, and now I'm in a different chapter, one that I think of as the after. The end and the after are what brought us here today. But I can't leave out the beginning. Phil and I met on our first day of university in chemistry class. I was 17 and he was 19, and we were friends for 3 years before we started dating. I wish there was some way to capture Phil in words for you so that you could understand just how much was lost when Phil died. I can tell you how sweet and funny he was, how empathetic and understanding, how in the 17 years I knew him, I didn't hear him say an unkind word about anyone. I can tell you that he was an amateur musician and learned how to play all of my favorite songs on the guitar, which we sang together in our living room. I can tell you that he was in the Army Reserves when I met him, studied forensic science, and then worked as a genetics technologist in Toronto. I can tell you how smart he was and how much he loved sharing the things he learned with others. I can tell you about his love for Lego and how movies were the biggest comfort in life for him, and how we could talk for hours about life and philosophy, science, politics, and religion. I can tell you about the time he offered to wear my Hello Kitty flip-flops home because they were giving me blisters, and we ended up having matching scars because they gave him a blister in the same spot. Or how he would walk me to work even after a decade together just so we could spend more time together. And because he knew that my job gave me anxiety. I can tell you that he stepped up whenever someone needed help, friends and strangers alike, and about the obnoxiously cute nicknames we would come up for each other. But nothing I can say about Phil compares to the person he was. The words in the stories don't do him justice. Phil wasn't perfect, of course. Sometimes when I realize that I'm looking back on our lives together with rose-tinted glasses, I would call him St. Philip, to remind myself that the real Phil was complicated and human. Phil struggled with anxiety and depression. I didn't recognize it until years into our relationship. He always seemed so confident, and he had an infectious smile, and our lives together was filled with joy and laughter. Phil didn't want to die. He was open and honest with me the first time he made a suicide attempt. I took him to the hospital, and he was really receptive to getting help. He took his medication. He went to therapy. He spent hours in hospital waiting rooms and the walk-in psychiatrist's office when he couldn't get a dedicated one. He fought to stay he fought to stay alive for as long as he could. I knew that I might lose Phil to suicide. For a number of years, the first thing I would do when I came home after working the night shift was to check if he was still breathing. Knowing that it could happen doesn't prepare you for when it does. On a night in 2017, Phil showed up at my workplace upset and disoriented, and I ended up leaving early to be with him. It seemed like he was having a breakdown, and over the next few days, he started becoming worried that the food that we were eating was poisoned. He had been self-medicating with marijuana, and the psychiatrist thought he had developed marijuana-induced psychosis. Getting him back to a stable place was hard. Initially, Phil was very open to getting help, but his paranoia increased, and he eventually became suspicious of me as well. He needed more help, but you can't force somebody to get help unless they're seen as a danger to themselves or others. Eventually, he did get the help he needed, and by 2019, he was doing better than ever. He brought up going off of his antidepressants, and I told him he should wait and talk to his doctor. I suggested that he wait until after our wedding, since weddings can be stressful, and he agreed to wait. But a few months after we married, I noticed a change in Phil's behavior. He was acting strange and could go from laughing to himself to crying within a matter of minutes. He started making comments that hinted that the paranoia had returned. Eventually, he admitted that he had gone off his medication on his own without talking to his doctor. He weaned them too quickly and went into withdrawal. We were able to get him help, and we were working on getting him back to the normal medication doses, but he was really depressed and started using marijuana again. It was over the Christmas holidays. His doctor's office was closed on January 2nd, so we were planning to go on January 3rd to see about increasing his medications again. I could tell that he was really struggling. He was on the phone with his parents off and on, and then he came in from our balcony after talking with his mom on the phone outside, and he said to me, "I can't take this anymore." I asked him what was going on, and he told me that the Freemasons were playing music outside to harass him when he was on the balcony. So I knew for sure that he was having psychosis, and I knew what "I can't take it anymore" meant. So I held Phil in an embrace so he couldn't get away from me. I asked him if we could go to the hospital and if I could call an ambulance, and eventually he agreed. My phone was on the floor and I couldn't reach it, so I told him that we'd have to stand up to get it together because I wasn't letting go of him. But when we stood, he was able to overpower me. He jumped over the back of the couch and went out to the balcony, and by the time I got out there, he was already gone. And then I heard the sound of him hitting the ground. I'm sure there are things I've forgotten about that night. But that sound isn't one of them. Nor can I forget the way my chest felt when the adrenaline began pulsing through my body, or my own primal screams that I had no control over. The way Phil looked when I reached him in our courtyard, or the way his body felt when I pointlessly tried to perform CPR on him. The sound of his father's voice repeatedly saying, "You're joking, right?" when I called him to tell him what happened. Or being questioned by the police in my state of shock because I had to be ruled out as a suspect in his death. The night Phil died, I played solitaire on my phone repeatedly for hours in the hotel room that I was put up in with my friend and a cat. I wasn't allowed to go home to my apartment for 2 weeks. It seems so absurd, but so much is when it comes to death. There's so much that no one talks about, like, how do you survive those first few minutes? Hours, days, months. What happens after the end? You hear about denial, anger, depression, acceptance, but for me, fear was a huge one. Fear about what was going to happen to me and my life. How could I keep going on without him? And did I even want to? I immersed myself in every book and audiobook, podcast that I could find about grief because I was afraid of what was going to happen now and I didn't know what to expect. And I joined support groups with people who went through similar experiences, which helped me feel less alone in the pain, fear, sorrow, anger, and the absurdity that death and loss bring. It made crying in the grocery store over ham that had Phil's birthday as the expiry date seem perfectly reasonable, and that it was okay that I hardly cried at Phil's funeral. I could talk about the difficult details of Phil's death without being looked at with horror or pity, but instead with understanding and even relief. I went to counseling and I journaled, and it all helped, but it wasn't easy. COVID left me very isolated in my grief, and fewer people came to check on me. And a lot of people I expected to be there for me dropped the ball. And sometimes the most supportive people were ones that I barely knew. When Phil died, so much of me died with him. I gave up my job, my apartment, the city we lived in together, and the friends and life we had there. I lost my best friend and my soulmate. I lost the person who I was with Phil, our inside jokes and shared memories, and the future we planned together. Life isn't easy, and I lost the person who promised to get through it all with me. He left me to pick up the pieces by myself when we were supposed to be a team. But I can never stay mad at him. The anger comes for sure. But I know that he was sick and that it was his illness that took him, as much as cancer or heart disease takes others. It's just a lot harder to wrap your mind around. People talk about grief in terms of waves, and at first you'll feel like you'll be overtaken by them. You feel like you're drowning, coming up for air only to be dragged back under again. But over time, the waves do start to calm. I think about Phil every day. I miss him every day. But it has softened over time, like sea glass whose sharp edges soften with the waves. For a long time, I couldn't imagine a life after Phil. I didn't want to. People will say that you're so strong, but the reality is that after Phil died, life just kept going whether I wanted it to or not, taking me further and further away from him and from the life that we had together. And now I'm in the after, and it sucks because Phil isn't here. But somehow it's becoming okay. I've started to rebuild my life, and hope for the future has slowly returned. I'm still here, even though Phil isn't, and it seems less impossible than it once did. Thank you.
Janice. How did you feel? Good. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know what else I can say after that. I've had the privilege of accompanying Janice through her grief journey, and I've seen the changes. So I know it's possible. I know it's possible. Thank you, Janice, for doing that in memory of Phil, for making meaning. So, with further ado, I'm not going to stay up here much longer. Don't think I can outdo that. I have 3 wishes that over time, you will be able to find a way to live with your loved one's suicide, as Janice has. Maybe find the answers to those unanswered questions, or come up with answers that you're able to live with. I hope that through your mourning, you will find a way to create a continuing bond and honor your loved one. And I wish you courage and strength and serenity as you go forward. I'll end with this. Iris Bolton, in her book, My Son, My Son. I don't know why. I'll never know why. I don't have to know why. I don't like it. What I have to do is make a choice about my living. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for doing this, not only for yourself, but for your loved one. You're doing it for your loved one so that you can get through this and live well, because you did love well. Anything, any comments, questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, if you have suicide and then you have the person that's going to commit suicide, is there a difference between a person, say in Janice's case, or a person that makes it look like an accident?
Is there a difference?
Yes. Because if it's made to look like an accident, to me, her grief would be more than a person that was killed in an accident. Because an accident's an accident. See what I'm saying?
So are you saying that it actually is a suicide, but that it appeared to be an accident?
Right, for insurance purposes or family or whatever.
Okay, if I understand your question correctly, it's unlikely that there was any thinking or intention behind it being set up like an accident, because their thinking is not logical at the time. So they're not necessarily thinking about the ramifications or the benefits to their family financially. They're thinking more in terms of, I'm a burden to my family, and if I'm not here, they'll be better off without me. And I know that's not the case from families, but that's what they feel. I think that the circumstances, no matter what the circumstances are, each person has to come to their own, find their own answers that they can live with. As long as, you know, there's an understanding, it's grounded in reality that their loved one has died. And I think after you've gone through why it's difficult to grieve a suicide death, it's about missing that person. It's about living without that person. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I can expand if not.
I got it.
Sort of answered it? Okay. Is there anything else? Anything else you'd like to go over or ask? Okay. Our next presentation through Grieving Hearts is next month, and it'll be the presentation on the holidays, how to get through the holiday season. So that is obviously a subject that will touch everybody. We do specific presentations such as this. We do presentations, death of a spouse, death of a sibling, as an adult, death of a child, death through suicide, sudden death, but then also very general topics such as how to get through the holidays, and then the new year, facing a new year without your loved one as well. So you can certainly check the Families First website for future Grieving Hearts presentations. Thank you very much. Drive carefully in this rain, and thank you again for coming out. Good night, everyone.